Well, hello there. This is Luis Manuel Garcia-Mispireta, but Luis is fine. And this here is my first time doing something, trying to do something that sits somewhere between the academic presentations that I've been giving, for more than half my life, but especially a lot recently. And, this newfangled, and by newfangled I mean nearly 20 years old, thing on YouTube, the YouTube essaying and the podcasting and so on. I've been wanting for a long time to move over into, not move over, but I've been wanting for a long time to start doing YouTube based, or video essays. I've been wanting for a long time to get into doing proper video essays, and the technology has really caught up, but also the popular practice has really caught up. It's something now that lots of people do for YouTube, for TikTok, for other things, and yeah, so this is my attempt to. This is my first try. So everybody be gentle, but also I do want feedback. And this is going to be a preview of, not a preview, this is a condensed, excerpted version of one of the chapters from my book, forthcoming book on Duke University Press, called Together Somehow, Music, Affect, and Intimacy on the Dance Floor. It's a book about stranger intimacy. It's a book about people who don't know each other and how they get along on dance floors, especially in club culture, especially on the floors of raves and techno parties and that kind of thing. It was primarily based on fieldwork I did in Paris and Chicago and Berlin, especially between about 2006 and 2010 or 11. Although I stayed on living in Berlin for a few more years after that, which also gets folded into my experience. Or that also informs how I write about it now. There's not much more. I don't want to get into too much detail, but there are two things that I want to highlight. Two concepts that I'm going to be hitting in this essay or this talk. Half or 40 minutes to an hour's worth of content is 5,000 something words, whereas this chapter is about 10, I think, or maybe 9,000 words. So, so I have trimmed this down a lot. For those of you who are into anime and who read manga as well, the book is the manga, this is the anime, right? So, I have done a lot of trimming. And in particular, there's a whole sort of subsection, or there's a whole other half to this chapter where I look at, I talk about French cultural policy in relation to multiculturalism. I talk about, I talk about French club culture to a degree, or more precisely, I talk about some of the experiences and perspectives of Parisian clubbers I knew who were going to Berlin as well, and how they sort of made the comparison between the two when it came to things like bouncers and door selection and so on. So a lot of that's been scrapped. Or not scrapped, it's still in the book. And similarly, there's going to be a couple of spots as I'm going through here where I'm going to just summarize verbally some hilarious anecdotes and fascinating anecdotes from my fieldwork, which you can get a much more detailed and also, I think, funnier version in the book. So, so here I am shilling my book. I am going to shill my book until I die. So these are the two concepts that I want to engage with while I'm at it. Light subculture and embedded diversity. Both of these terms hopefully are interesting, or not interesting, but, hopefully both of these terms are quizzical enough to whet your appetite or to make you curious. By the end of this, I hope that you'll understand what both of these concepts are. These are two concepts that I'm trying to sort of build out through this chapter. Both of them as hopefully vocabulary or tools that can help us to unpack what goes on when bouncers are making decisions about who gets in and who doesn't, not just bouncers, but the door staff in general. And more broadly, I hope this helps us to understand some of the kind of, let's say, like Western liberal ideals of universal inclusivity, liberal ideals in particular, and how those sort of utopian aspirations are turned into something that happens in the real world, something that's real, and that you can go and visit and experience. Except for not everybody can visit it, and except for it's club spaces become these performances of of inclusivity, but it's a kind of an inclusivity, or they become these spaces of diversity that give you the impression that they're inclusive, and you can have inclusive or feelings of being included when you're already inside. But all of this is carved out of all of this kind of happy togetherness and inclusivity is carved out from the real world and sort of sculpted from the real world through exclusion, right? And that's kind of the main argument here. But then there's a lot more detail and hopefully a lot of nuance that comes with that. So without further ado, let's keep going. And I want to start with a quote from Sarah Thornton. I'll explain who this is. I'll contextualize this in a second. So many clubbers talk about the rightness and the naturalness of the crowds in which they have had good experiences. They feel that they fit in, that they are integral to the group. The experience is not one of conformity, but one of spontaneous affinity. Good clubs are full of familiar strangers. As one of the first scholarly monographs to examine electronic dance music through an ethnographic lens, Sarah Thornton's Club Cultures presents an analysis of UK club culture in the early 1990s, providing perspectives and insights that continue to resonate with the contemporary research on nightlife scenes. In the foregoing quotation here, Thornton summarizes the discourse of clubbers who've had good experiences within clubbing crowds, whatever that might mean. So in other words, those who succeed in gaining access to the dance floor and sustaining a sense of belonging there have these good experiences. For them, the composition of the crowd to which they belong feels right and natural. However, for those whose entry is challenged or refused at the doors of dance music venues, bear witness to the deliberate stage management behind the scenes of spontaneous affinity. Electronic dance music parties offer a curated microcosm of cosmopolitanism, a selectively multicultural field of familiar strangers who incarnate a collective aspiration to post-identity ecumenical belonging, right? This desire to belong beyond the limits of what identity can do for you, right? Vaguely defined, but strongly felt, this fluid belonging constitutes a core value of electronic dance music scenes, reflecting the genre's emergence out of queer, urban, ethnically marginalized communities and into a global rave phenomenon. Notably, this heterogeneous mix does not come about spontaneously, even if a sense of spontaneous affinity may be part of how this mix is experienced. A great deal of effort goes into the planning and execution of dance music parties, both to attract the right crowd and to exclude those deemed somehow unassimilable to these festive microcultures. In an essay on the techniques of early disco DJs in New York, ethnomusicologist Kai Fickencha describes the scene at the Disco Mega Club in Studio 54 as, quote, marked by an intentionally monitored heterogeneity, relying to a large extent on the selection, that is, the permitting or refusing of entry based on varying mixtures of explicit and tacit principles. So based on the selection provided by the door staff, we get this intentionally monitored heterogeneity. Even at the Loft, that is David Mancuso's members-only party in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, one of the earliest crucibles of disco in the 1970s in New York City, measures were taken to carefully select and filter a crowd of dancers that reflected contemporary ideals of progressive cosmopolitanism. It's not the mix, it's the selection, writes Fickencha, who is quoting a veteran disco DJ, Kenny Carpenter, from Studio 54, who was in turn invoking a motto that he attributed to David Mancuso. So although this motto refers to the relative importance of two core DJ skills, it also serves as a useful starting point for a critical rewriting of a club culture's utopian narratives of inclusive dance floors, encouraging us to focus on the processes of selection at work behind the apparently spontaneous and effortless mixing of partygoers at these events. In particular, Fickencha's quotation alerts us to the impact of the door on the feeling of collective intimacy at dance music parties.